Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar on Cloud Native Security Fabric, a critical conversation about the future of cloud security in the era of AI. I'm Alex Escalona, Director of Brand and Digital Experience at Aviatrix, and I'm thrilled to be your host today. Before we dive in, let me set the stage. We're living in an era where traditional security approaches are under tremendous strain and failing all too often. Security is not a product, it is a process. And the process historically has been about control. But what we need today is a process that is decentralized and dynamic, and realistically addresses today's network and threat landscapes. The rise of AI, the proliferation of ephemeral workloads such as those created by Kubernetes, and the increasing sophistication of threat actors have all created security gaps that existing technologies simply cannot address. Cloud Native Security Fabric represents a paradigm shift. It moves us from bolted-on security to embedded, policy-driven protection that moves with your workloads in real time. Today, I'm joined by two exceptional experts who will help us explore this critical topic. Doug Merritt is the CEO of Aviatrix, bringing decades of leadership experience in enterprise technology and security. Doug has been at the forefront of cloud transformation and has had extensive conversations with CISOs from Fortune 500 companies about their evolving security challenges. John Grady is an industry analyst at ESG Research, where he focuses on cybersecurity trends and enterprise security strategies. John's research and insights help organizations understand the threat landscape and evaluate emerging security technologies. Doug and John, thank you both for being here. Let's begin.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah,
Glad to be here.
Doug, let's start with the broader picture. How do you think our overall approach or philosophy towards security needs to shift in today's landscape?
I think that you started with the right direction, Alex, which is given the rise of cloud, and I think Gen AI and agentic AI and serverless functions and ephemeral functions just make this even more aggressive as far as the need. There's a philosophical shift necessary. Right? We go back through millennia of human thought around security. Right? This thing about physical security, my own physical security, and the security of my home, and the security of my business 300 years ago. It's been very protection oriented. That's the whole castle and moat framework that people came up with decades and decades ago. A series of layered defenses, and everything is about trying to prevent bad people from getting access to the things that you care about. The cloud has shifted a number of different things. In those old data center worlds, you had physical walls that were usually extraordinarily thick and well built. You had biometric scanning and badging and background checking, and to make sure that all the stuff inside that data center was safe and you knew who was going and going out, which was the castle mode orientation. And that worked pretty well until we connected the internet to the data centers. As soon as you plug the internet in, north-south traffic became an issue that people were worried about. North-south meaning the traffic going into and out of the data center from and to the internet. And we clustered tons of capability, firewalls, IDS, IPS, VPN frameworks around those data centers to try and protect the data centers from the internet. So the traffic inside that data center, which generally was called east-west, the direction doesn't make any sense anymore in the cloud, was generally safe. And the orientation was as trusted. You're inside the castle, you must be trusted. From a data perspective, that's kind of a silly perspective to start with. It's not bad, like you should do that, but most breaches are generated by employees. So I would postulate that we should have questioned that even 20, 30 years ago, because they're safe, they're trusted, they're inside the castle. And a lot of those are mistakes, not malicious, but there's malicious activities as well. But with the cloud, now things are completely upended. There's thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of perimeters. If you think about those data centers, every workload that you put in the cloud now has its own perimeter. So every VPC or VNet, every Kubernetes cluster, every serverless function, every API endpoint, every PaaS service, they've got to be watched and protected. So you've blown up the perimeter and expanded it by 10x or 100x, and agentic makes that worse. And the network that connects to those and often connects between those is the internet. So the internet is now largely the enterprise network with an atomized perimeter, and most of these workloads are becoming ephemeral, which means the old ways of addressing them. I've got a static IP address, or I've got a known state of an entity. I know what compute it's attached to. is gone. So that, I think it just demands literal shift in philosophical orientation on how to protect yourself.
Sure, that moat around the castle has been obliterated, and you may not even know who's roaming the halls of your castle.
Exactly. Man, so much. Why didn't you answer that question, Alex? It's so much cleaner.
John, given everything we just covered, it sounds like zero trust needs to be rethought altogether. What are the limitations that you're seeing today, and what's next?
Yeah, it's certainly more important than it's ever been. It's funny because in that model that Doug laid out, the existing kind of castle and moat, that was in place when zero trust first came up. And the idea was more, you have to assume breach and assume that bad actors are in your environment, even though we were still in that kind of legacy model. Then as we shifted, as Doug said, more towards distributed infrastructure and the use of cloud, that whole idea of not assuming that an entity should be trusted just because of where it is became that much more important, because things are spread all over the place. And so that whole idea of removing any sort of implicit trust from the environment, enforcing least privilege authorization and authentication, that all just became critical. I think the problem with zero trust has been that it's been really focused on the user and remote access. And that's where we really saw the tipping point and the focus on, from a tooling perspective, ZTNA in particular. When we've done research on zero trust, only 18% of organizations say that they're starting their journey with applications or workloads. And it's just as important for that part of the environment. But I mean, given where we were 5 years ago with the shift to remote work, you kind of get why there was a focus on a user, but it's been a while now, and there needs to be kind of a rethinking of where to put some of these resources. And, entities like NIST and CISA have had that workload focus from the beginning when they've put out frameworks, but obviously enterprises need to prioritize and kind of pick and choose. Not to say it's not important, but that's where they've kind of put their resources. So we are starting to see that shift, but it's been early. But one of the reasons that I think there hasn't been as much pickup, I mentioned ZTNA, that was a big step forward in terms of applying zero trust tenets to users. On the workload side to date, I don't think we've had the tooling to support the strategy. And to be clear, zero trust is a strategy or an architecture, but you do need technology to kind of operationalize it. And so there haven't been tools that can kind of keep pace with cloud environments that are constantly changing, constantly scaling, workloads ramping up and down and so on. So I think that's another piece of it. As those tools come to market, I think enterprises will be more likely to focus in that area around zero trust.
Those tools sound increasingly important. And Doug, as you well know, this is where Aviatrix is leading the charge with Cloud Native Security Fabric. For those less familiar, what is CNSF and why is it such a shift from traditional security approaches?
It's great. It's a great lead in. So as John was talking about, there are three legs to a zero trust stool. And to make it effective, ideally, you've got all three legs and the same length. So this tool actually is stable and works. And he was talking a lot about identity and access. Identity is really important, is one of those. Endpoint's another. If you think about the basics of technology, you need devices and compute that people are operating against or agents in the future. And then network is the third, because those things have got to be connected. You've got a person that's trying to go from something to something else to get their task fulfilled. Network becomes really important, was what a cloud native security fabric is, a focus on within the cloud, between every workload, every virtual private cloud or virtual container, every Kubernetes cluster, every API endpoint, every PaaS service, having the ability to both observe the communication that's happening between those and the communication in and out of those workloads, because many of those workloads are directly attached to the internet itself. So you've got to be able to observe first, but the critical element is you've got to also be able to take action and enforce. If you look at most breaches, it's not that difficult for bad actors to get a foothold in a cloud environment, given how big it is and all the critical vulnerabilities, et cetera. The important part, the real damage happens not at the moment of insertion, but as the bad actor patiently begins to map the network, begins to get additional credentials or visibility on where different workloads sit, and begins to move laterally to get to the assets that they really care about. So at the core, the cloud native security fabric is about a zero trust cloud workload stance to complement the endpoint and identity elements, and really close that loop and create the third leg of the stool.
It's an increasingly important third leg. John, what's ESG's take on cloud native security fabric? How do you think your clients will respond to the concept?
Yeah, I think there'll be a lot of interest. I mean, it certainly addresses an area of pain for a lot of organizations. When we've asked about how they feel about securing public cloud infrastructure versus on-prem, 47% say public cloud is harder to defend against, and I think it's another 22% say they're about the same. So very few say it's easier than on-prem. So it's a key pain point. And we mentioned the rate of change, ensuring performance. So historically, when we've talked about securing public cloud infrastructure, we've used an on-premises model, and from a routing perspective and how kind of traffic flows, that's has the potential to introduce performance issues. And we know security teams are a little more cognizant of that than they've been in the past. So that's difficult. Costs come into play as well. And so these are all things that I think the model that CNSF is driving really seeks to address and fundamentally change some of those issues. We see a lot of organizations using multiple tools, either from CSPs or third-party security providers, and may do so for a lot of different reasons. I mean, there's still a lot of folks who think around kind of a defense in depth approach, but the reality is that complexity ends up introducing security gaps over time and actually has diminishing returns in a lot of cases. And so simplifying the security infrastructure is a big focus. And just from a cloud infrastructure perspective, I kind of touched on this, but when we think about kind of the VLAN model and how security has typically been placed, we're kind of getting into hairpinning, which the cloud really wasn't built for. And so, again, that's an area where this release, I think, has an opportunity to really change the way that security architects think about how to implement some of these capabilities. So because CNSF is embedded into the fabric of the cloud itself and plays across multiple clouds, that's another issue. Consistency in multi-cloud environments, which are increasingly prevalent. I think folks will be really interested to learn more and see how it could help address some of the challenges they've been dealing with for a number of years.
Yeah, and to the point you've made there, John, increasingly complex environments and increasingly complex landscapes that we're operating within. Doug, sort of double clicking there, what are the biggest drivers you see for CNSF today? What has fundamentally changed in the world to make this kind of shift necessary?
I think there's a handful of elements that are really driving a lot more interest. One, the volume of attacks are just getting almost deafening at this point in time. We've got much better organization on attackers, and the AI movement is certainly helping them be much more persistent. And I think that is having people step back and really think, I've deployed so much technology, I'm complying with the bulk of the standards, like what is missing? What's wrong here? How am I still getting attacked? And I think it keeps many of them point back to cloud and point back to that orientation that CNSF works to address, which is a pervasive network security fabric that thoroughly blankets all workloads within any cloud, and bridges that across multiple clouds. And so I think there's a growing awareness that this change in philosophy might be that there's a need to protect these the workload communication a little bit more aggressively. I think when you add in the first waves of cloud were lift and shift. When you lifted and shifted, that still looked like your old environment. They're static workloads. They weren't ephemeral like Kubernetes clusters or serverless functions. I think as people began to modernize, and as we see serverless becoming very, very prevalent within most of the organization's environments, even if you try and take an old defend the perimeter at all costs approach, those are very difficult workloads to actually protect with any traditional means. There is no static IP address. The workload itself is not static, and therefore there's not a reliable network path to that entity. So unless you've got a network security capability that we're evangelizing with CNSF that not only natively deploys inside that cloud fabric, as John was talking about, but takes a very, very different approach on observing and enforcing communications in and out between those workloads, it's almost impossible to get done, even with the CSP tools or next generation firewalls or any of the traditional mechanisms. And agentic AI and Gen AI just puts that on steroids. They're ephemeral workloads. People are excited about it, as we are at Aviatrix internally and within our products. And I think that is also both attackers using AI, I think, is making people a little bit more aware of, hey, how do I cover the surface? But then the deployment of AI, I think, starts to, again, register on how am I going to protect this stuff.
So despite a surplus of tools, security teams obviously still have no shortage of troubles on their mind, and the approach of agentic AI and ephemeral workloads are not decreasing those challenges anymore. John, when you talk to security teams, what are the biggest challenges you hear they're grappling with?
Yeah, there's a few, and I think Doug kind of hit on some of these, but in my opinion, the biggest is still lateral movement. So we've asked in research that we've done, how often or have you been attacked across your public cloud infrastructure? And 43% said they had in the last 24 months. And the most common cause was lateral movement. So I think there's been more of a focus, despite Doug laid this out really well earlier, the fact that you can't really consider that traffic east-west because it's moving north-south and it's fundamentally different. But there's still been a focus on, using a perimeter model and just securing inbound traffic, east-west, internal communications, however you want to think about it, it's really been ignored. And I do think part of that is the difficulty from a tooling perspective in doing that at scale, at least to this point. And I think, as Doug said as well, once the attacker gets that initial foothold, if you don't have that control, it's kind of open season. So, I think the micro-segmentation aspects of CNSF will really allow organizations to, they realize that's something they need to do, they just haven't been able to, and so they'll be able to kind of, perform on that metric. Visibility has also been an issue as well, and some of this goes to the organization and kind of security teams, network teams, application owners, and the complexity in terms of understanding who's doing what, keeping pace, and so, tying things together from a technology perspective can help with that and get folks on the same page. So that's really important. Attacks move a lot faster than they have in the past. So again, just keeping up with attackers and pushing policies out quickly when you do identify something malicious that's happening in the environment has been a challenge to date. And so that's really been a core focus. And I think the last one is probably, again, seeking better integration across some of the different tools that are in the environment. I think it's unrealistic to say you're going to move to a single tool. Platforms have come up a lot in the industry over the last couple of years. But really that needs to be an open architecture, because you're always going to need to integrate technologies from different providers. But having that kind of done for you, having those tools work together, without the end user organization having to do that themselves, goes a long way, because most are struggling with skills. They don't have the time to do that. And often they don't end up working as well together as they would like. So, I think platforms from that perspective, or fabrics, as kind of Aviatrix has called out, are really the way to go and ultimately solve a lot of those issues.
Absolutely. There's quite a lot at stake if you don't have those integrations airtight. Doug, you've had some deep conversations with CISOs from larger organizations recently. What are they telling you about the security challenges keeping them up at night?
I think I really have such deep empathy for the CISO job. I think it's one of the hardest jobs of any function in any industry. The speed that CEOs are demanding that their teams operate, especially with the AI raising its head, puts so much pressure on the CISO, because every CEO is pushing their technology teams to go faster, deploy more product, deploy more capability. What's our Gen AI strategy? How do we go as thoroughly and quickly as possible on that? And CISOs are struggling to keep up with the pace of change inside their organization. If they are too, because they've got to worry about compliance, they've got to worry about regulatory structure, and they've got to try and take a thorough view of these environments that are moving so quickly. And if they are too demanding on slow down, they're just going to get run over. So I think the number one thing that has come back is, how do I keep pace with the development teams, with the actual technology teams, and still do my job? Because if I can't find a way to do that, I'm going to get blamed, whether I got run over or not. They're the accountable party. And then I think there's a lot of tool fatigue, as John was talking about. There are so many specialty tools that are all trying to tackle little different areas, and it's a pretty overwhelming environment for most of them. They're having a difficult time keeping pace with all the compliance and regulatory changes that are constantly happening. And then there's a lot that people have been talking about that has been going on for decades, I think is really important right now, which is, how does CISOs do a better job of translating what their charter is and what they're attempting to do into the right economic constructs that a CEO and a set of board members would understand. And so that constant grappling with most executives face the choice of, if I don't go fast enough, I will have this business risk. And I know that there is a security risk that goes with it. But if I don't execute on the business side, I don't have a business. So I'll take a little bit of risk over here on the security side to make that balance a little bit better. You've got to portray security as an accelerant for the business, and something that actually enhances the enterprise value or capability of an organization.
Yeah, that's no small order, right? CISOs have to balance compliance and regulatory requirements. They've got to secure the organization. They can't slow down development. They have to do all of this amid intense tool fatigue and an evolving threat landscape. I mean, wow. John, what are your researchers and analysts seeing as the most pressing threats for them to be aware of it that are looming on the horizon?
Yeah, it'd be easier if there was one answer. Unfortunately, there's a lot out there. It goes without saying. Ransomware is still a big issue. It's funny, it doesn't get the attention that it did 2 or 3 years ago, but man, when you get hit, it is still incredibly painful. And so it's still a big issue. But, we continue to see more sophisticated nation state attacks, and, those can target larger organizations and critical infrastructure, but conceivably anyone can be a target there. One thing we've seen is supply chain attacks, and that's where things kind of intersect with nation state actors. There was just an attack on Microsoft SharePoint, and so technology vendors are just such a ripe target, because then you can go after their customers as you wish, as opposed to having to specify a target yourself. And so that's still an issue we really haven't solved, and should be top of mind for any organization. Be remiss to not talk about AI. That's obviously, going way back, and kind of, the idea of script kiddies, now lower level attackers can kind of up their game leveraging AI. Stronger attackers can scale out and do more, just in terms of target identification, to say nothing of writing malicious code. There's just so many opportunities there. And we've typically seen, when we've asked the question in our research, that there's more belief that attackers will have the advantage when it comes to AI, rather than AI helping for security. I think that may tip over time, but right now there's some consternation there. All that said, I think one of the things we talked about earlier, lateral movement, is an issue. And then more than that, this idea of kind of unforced errors. There's still so many attacks, and I don't have a number, but I would say most, but that's not a scientific calculation, are known vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, just issues that we don't know about. We haven't had time to get to, just manual errors during configuration. We're talking about the speed of cloud. That really comes into play. Open ports, just simple things that get overlooked because folks are trying to move too fast. 0 days and nation states got a lot of the attention. We still haven't solved the fundamentals. And I think that's that's really the most concerning part.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty to be concerned about as you consider all of that. And these are not one-off attacks that we're talking about. They're only growing in prevalence and quantity. It's the understatement of the century to say that we've seen some significant security breaches as of late. Doug, how do you see the role of nation states in supporting threat actors, and what does this mean for enterprise security?
I think the attackers have gotten much more organized, both very, very well-funded collectives of nefarious actors. We've seen the pictures and gotten all the reports and stories of compounds in different parts of the world where hundreds of people are either going to work or imprisoned and are working 24/7 using, as John said, the latest agentic capabilities, which is why I think they've got a little bit of the attackers got a little bit of an edge right now. They're organized, they're well-funded, and they're technology first. And then the state backing makes it really difficult too. I mean, there's a lot of capabilities that major governments have around the world, ours included, that are pretty advanced and sophisticated. And when you turn that capability against commercial entities in the Western world, it's a pretty unfair fight. Going back to unless you totally change your philosophy, right? That's what we're arguing at from the very, very beginning. And that I worry that the world, including CISOs, get a little bit too fascinated with how did the breach happen? It was a HVAC repairman that let their credentials, gave their credentials to someone else, and that steals all the headlines. That's not how the attack happened. That's how someone got initial access. And initial access, as John was talking about, is not that difficult to get anymore. The attack happened because the attackers were patient. They got inside and they're patient. And as a nation state and an organized criminal group, you can do that. You can sit there for weeks or months. Attackers think in graphs, and we organize in silos. So they're just trying to find all the connection points and patterns that they need their network access to do so they can understand the entire landscape of an organization. And then they take their time. So without something that pervasively covers every workload, to look at all inbound and outbound communications with that workload, because you can usually see bad behavior, aberrant behavior, if you just are doing basic what the industry calls egress security, and without a pervasive fabric that monitors and can enforce communications between all the workloads. With those two, you can really stop the movement that we're talking about and the patience of having bad folks execute their attack. You have to assume, you just assume that an employee can go rogue, you by nature would change your philosophy of there are bad people inside the castle array. There are bad people that have permissions already. What do I do now? And that is what we're arguing for with CNSF, which is the zero trust. We're actually just saying, fill out your zero trust landscape. Like, you already believe in the philosophy, you're focused on endpoint, you're focused on identity and access, now focus on workload. You're just missing the third critical component.
Right. Without that pervasive workload protection, it is, as John said earlier, open season as soon as they're in. It's frightening to consider. I mean, our economy and our way of life are increasingly dependent on digital networks. John, how vulnerable are we, and why are traditional technologies failing to protect us?
Yeah, I mean, the interconnectedness of systems and data has certainly increased the risk that we face and organizations face. And I think a lot of times it comes down to kind of a cost benefit analysis, and this is what CISOs do and organizations do in terms of the benefits of that greater level of connectivity and digitalization versus the security implications. And you just see over and over again that the business values and business benefits end up winning out. Not to say that there can't be an attack, but maybe not right away. And so it can be kind of easy to overlook it at times. And I think it can be hard for security teams to kind of argue against that. Just a small example, even outside of what we're talking about with workload security, but I cover SaaS security and kind of had a handle on that. And now, the ecosystem of SaaS applications and plugins and what's connected to what is so hard to track, or organizations really don't have an idea. And that's a lot of the problem on the enterprise side, is folks just not knowing what they don't know across a lot of these different areas. And cloud connectivity is certainly a good example of that as well. And so, from a vendor perspective, I think it's just fundamentally kind of rethinking, how we operate, how the products and solutions that we offer. We've been trying to solve these new problems with the same technology. And when it comes to cloud security and cloud network security in particular, that's been the case for a long time. Had on-premises firewalls, we just moved those to the cloud, and it doesn't change, or it doesn't address the changing architecture. And so I think that's the biggest hurdle to overcome. There's no way around the fact that systems are more connected than ever. And so from a security perspective, we just have to kind of fundamentally start over rather than trying to subtly re-architect what we've been doing for 10, 15, 20 years.
Right. Back to that total change in philosophy. Doug, I know this is something you feel passionately about. What is your take on just how serious this is? What's at stake?
Yeah, it's, I think, just to build on what John was saying, there isn't a major service I can think of in our economy today that wouldn't be dramatically impacted if the service, if the entity that provides that service goes down. We saw with UHG and Change Health, right? Our prescription fulfillment capability is completely dependent on an online set of interactions. Doctors' scripts are dependent upon that. Every airline reservation is dependent upon it. Our food delivery, our Uber delivery, there isn't a corner of our society that isn't, that where you trace the supply chain of the thing I am trying to get done, it's not dependent on a online capability. And that online capability is largely going through the cloud right now. So that's a lot of my passion on this topic, is if we can't change our philosophy and take a more effective and pervasive zero trust approach, our way of life is deeply threatened. Right? It's not hard to imagine organized actors taking down 3 critical things simultaneously, just to scare the heck out of the population. Take down a major hotel chain, a major airline, and a major retailer, just to scare the heck out of consumers. And we can close those gaps. We need to close those gaps. It just requires a change in philosophy.
Can't be overstated how dire the stakes are right now. We know that lots of organizations have built their security stack. We know that today some of those approaches are perhaps a little bit piecemeal. Would you say that's accurate, Doug?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, we know that there's some big...
I think vendors are doing the best they can to try and cover as much landscape as they can, but they start with a point. I'm really focusing on securing APIs in the cloud. So when you look at how diverse that landscape is, the poor CISO and their organization goes back to, oh my gosh, I've got to have 40 different tools to cover this landscape.
Yeah, of course. And despite that piecemeal approach, many organizations have made big investments in their current tools. We know they're not simply going to throw them all out. Maybe tell us a little, how does CNSF work with what's already in place instead of requiring a full replacement?
There are 2 reasons that we chose this term fabric to try and describe the category. One was what John touched on, that to do it effectively inside a cloud or between clouds, it's got to be pervasive inside that cloud and between the clouds. So I think about a fabric, that large comfy blanket in my house, it's going to cover the entire couch if it does its job. How do you get that pervasive orientation? But then the other piece is a fabric is a weave, and there are different elements that come together to make up that quilt or that end result. So if you were, and for what we're advocating, you have to be completely open. We are focused on zero trust cloud workload security, but that needs to integrate with endpoint. It needs to integrate with identity and access. It needs to integrate with any of the awesome cloud scanning capability that's being done today. It needs to integrate with the higher order application protection, workload protection vendors. It needs to integrate with next generation firewalls. A lot of people would assume that those are competitors. I think we can do many of the things. There's a whole host of things that you can't do with a next generation firewall inside the cloud. But if you've got those already deployed for perimeter defense, as John was talking about, awesome. We'll integrate. The CNSF needs to integrate with those. Cyber is a team sport. And I think any really effective cyber vendor needs to take that philosophy from the very, very beginning of we're just part of the landscape, and we've got to play well with others. So it emphasizes, it strengthens by adding a CNSF capability. You ideally strengthen your overall capability because it weaves into the chains and the fabrics that you already have in place.
Cyber is a team sport, and that sport requires the attention and focus of those team's captains. With that in mind, John, why is security such a critical issue for executives today?
Yeah, I think Doug may have mentioned this early on in the conversation, but I think it's ultimately because of what happens when security incidents or data breaches occur. When something impacts availability, when sensitive data is stolen or you can't meet your compliance obligations, it very quickly shifts from being an IT problem to a business issue. And so it's really incumbent on the business leaders to be proactive in engaging around security issues and matters and planning and so on. When you have an attack, there can be a direct impact on revenue if it's a revenue generating system, if it's kind of customer interactions or data is stolen and that gets disclosed, which is more likely to happen now with some of the changes from the SEC in terms of disclosure requirements. There's shareholder and brand value implications there. And one other issue is cyber insurance, and that's a really interesting and obviously changing market with some of the requirements becoming harder to meet and premiums going up. There's an impact on the bottom line there, right? So it only makes sense that executives are going to be involved in determining. We talked about kind of balancing, cost benefit analysis, risk and security and so on, and that's part of that whole discussion. And then we've seen examples in the past that ignorance isn't a defense for when security is overlooked, and so there can be career impacts as well. There's I think there's actually officially a fiduciary responsibility among the board at this point when it comes to cyber, and so it comes back to security and the business operating hand in hand, and it's really hard to break them apart. And so it has to be. We've covered this for a number of years at ESG, and we have seen an increase in awareness on this issue, which is good. Board members getting more involved, subcommittees being formed around that. So we're definitely moving in the right direction. But from where we're starting from, it's been a long journey.
Yeah, balancing security with business needs is, Doug, as you said earlier, what gives you so much empathy for CISOs and the rest of the executives today. From your conversations with CEOs and executives, Doug, how do they balance the need for the speed of innovation alongside the very real financial and reputational risks of a breach?
I think they're struggling, honestly. I think that they're really hoping that the CISO tenures are, like many other executive tenures, are under some attack. They're hoping that they get the right CISO that can find a way to keep pace with the development needs around them. And I think they're educating themselves on the true cost of a breach. I think what I was advocating at Splunk for years, that I would still advocate here, is running business today in the cyber front is a lot like riding a motorcycle. If you're a motorcycle rider, it's not if you're going to crash or get into some type of a motorcycle issue, it's when. And it's the same thing for cyber, because it's almost impossible, given the state of the environment, to avoid all breaches. It's what do you do? Like, how do you detect any type of bad entity inside your domain, inside your state, and how do you contain that movement? How do you both understand, detect, drive root cause, and contain as quickly as possible? And I think that's where board members and CEOs have got to continue to gravitate toward, and find ways to empower their CISO to the best of their ability without slowing down the speed that they're demanding. We've got a point of view that the Aviatrix solution, as the third leg of that zero trust stool, it allows CISOs to operate at the speed of development. It is baked into the DevSecOps process. It's all Terraform based. Elements that we've crafted for our solution within CNSF are highly autonomous and adaptable. They understand the current cloud environment and the millisecond and second by second changes in the cloud environment, so that it takes some of the onus on the human. Human can still be in the loop and observe, but for CISOs to come together with their CEOs, they've got to agree on how can they go as fast as possible while still protecting the estate.
Very good. Well, Doug and John, thank you both so much for this insightful discussion. As we have all heard today, Cloud Native Security Fabric marks a fundamental shift in how we think about cloud security, moving away from reactive, perimeter-based defensive towards proactive, embedded protection that moves with our workloads. Before we open it up for Q&A, let's quickly recap a few key takeaways. Traditional security approaches aren't built for today's cloud-native and AI-driven environments. We need a new model, one that is decentralized, dynamic, and built for warp speed. CNSF delivers embedded, policy-driven security that complements existing tools. The threat landscape, as we've heard, is evolving faster than ever, and our defenses need to keep up at machine speed. Security teams are tasked with moving at the pace of business while doing their critically important jobs of protecting the company. And lastly, this is not just a technology issue. It's a business imperative that requires executive focus and leadership. With that, let's open it up for questions. We have covered a lot of ground today, and we'd like to hear what's on your mind. So please feel free to drop your questions into the chat.
That was an awesome summary, Alex.
It was an awesome discussion to summarize, Doug. All right. Excellent. We've got some great questions here. Our first question for you, how can Kubernetes workloads be protected?
Yeah, that going back to the ephemeral nature that we're seeing right now, it's really, there are a whole host of network security constructs inside Kubernetes that are part of the standard definition of how do you launch and manage these Kubernetes clusters. The question that I think most people need to really step back from is, unless you are Kubernetes only and you've got a refined set of Kubernetes clusters, those constructs, the clusters need to integrate with the rest of your landscape and state. And the characteristics of that Kubernetes cluster, how data gets in and out, and then how do you deal with egress security? How do you deal with east-west movement? And then what kind of microsegmentation capability can you have within that Kubernetes cluster is radically different than what you'd see with a more stateful set of services. So with Aviatrix as our solution, or I think anyone that's going to be in the CNSF category, you have to be able to address that dynamic nature. And there's a whole host of capabilities and technologies that you can bring to that landscape that if any of you are interested in, like, just come back and ping us and we could do a deep dive on what's our viewpoint, how are we approaching it within Aviatrix that enables serverless function or ephemeral workload like Kubernetes to be tightly and effectively wrapped into the rest of your landscape with the same egress, east-west, macro segmentation, microsegmentation capabilities as the rest of the workloads.
Excellent. We have a question here. Is the Cloud Native Security Fabric available within different clouds, marketplaces?
It is. That's, again, I think one of the characteristics of a good Cloud Native Security Fabric is you need to deploy across all the major clouds. Packets and workloads span clouds for most organizations. And as any of you that are out there have seen, as you're trying to deploy infrastructure as a service capabilities in these clouds, they're all defined radically differently. The scope of any service doesn't have a lot of similarity. Let's just say a core routing networking service or a firewall service or a NATing service. They're not defined consistently across the clouds. The interfaces are very different. The API granularity is different. So an effective Cloud Native Security Fabric that's focused on the zero trust workload piece needs to mask that complexity from organizations. And more importantly, it needs to ensure policy pervasiveness. That, again, given that you likely are going to have transactions that span multiple clouds. That means they're touching different clouds, different workloads and clouds. You need to have confidence that you've got consistent and persistent execution of policy and remediation across those clouds. So I think it's a core characteristic of anyone that wants to be in the CNSF space.
Doug, our next question to you, can CNSF detect and respond to real-time threats automatically?
It can. And another interesting characteristic, if we look at our Wiz integration, and John, I know that you have some views here. There are a lot of tools out there that provide some observational capability. Like a Wiz scan does a great job of coming up with a very thorough list, minus some of the network constructs, I'll get to those in a second, of what needs to change, what policies need to change, what access needs to change, what admin rights need to change across the environment. The more difficult part is how do you actually enforce those? So they respond in real time. To do that effectively, you've got to be at the network layer. And then that, again, is the key characteristic of a cloud-native security fabric. There are vendors out there that will say, as long as you trombone or hairpin all that traffic over to our cloud, we'll take care of that for you. That is a really weird construct to offer organizations that have all their workloads inside the cloud. Like, you're going to literally string all the VPCs and Kubernetes clusters that you're paying AWS a ton of money for across a different network. Like, the traffic should flow within that cloud. And if you're at that network layer, not only can you get really interesting insights into behaviors because you're seeing packet level flows within those clouds, going back to, you've got to be in all the clouds, you've got to be deep in the network within those clouds, but you can take immediate action when you see odd behavior, because you can actually get into the network and stop those communications, cordon off a user, cordon off a workload, change where a workload is sending their data, given that they're going to a bad URL or a nefarious URL. So that real-time nature is incredibly important. It's not just observation, it's enforcement. And what we found is we're working with Wiz, we've got a great integration with Wiz. There are elements we can show them. Like, when you're at that network layer, you see some really interesting toxic combinations that they can identify from their scans that are separate than their identified scans. So you're really doing a much more comprehensive job of getting pervasive visibility, and then we become the enforcement layer.
We've talked a lot about balancing different competing priorities today. This next question touches on this as well. How do you ensure visibility without adding performance bottlenecks?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very common element within any firewalling or network security approach. To get that visibility, you need to be able to either directly control the traffic or fork the traffic. And in the cloud environment, like in the on-prem world, I think firewall vendors solve that pretty well. They've got to be really effective at grabbing and forwarding packets so they can do their analysis without interrupting the core routing traffic flow. And I think any CNSF, certainly the Aviatrix solution, does that super elegantly within the cloud. So it's a very high performance environment within the cloud. And you can get that visibility, that access, without interrupting without having a meaningful impact on latency that organizations are looking for within that cloud.
Excellent.
John, do you have any perspective on that?
Market level, I think the visibility concern is less around performance and more around consistency. We were talking about multi-cloud earlier, and it's just kind of how you efficiently aggregate that information if you're using different tools in different clouds and so on. So I think the performance piece is more from the actual, how the data plane is constructed and where the traffic is routed. They are both concerns, but I hear of them kind of connected a little bit less.
I think that's a really good perspective. I'd agree. Like, we've got, again, for an Aviatrix solution, they're happy to go deeper with any of you out there that are interested, but we do not impact performance. And any good vendor in this space should not have any notable impact on performance.
Well, as we consider balancing the concerns across different teams, our next question asks, can network teams and security teams both use the platform effectively? And I'll tag onto the end of that. Doug, perhaps you can double click on the alignment that this enables across DevOps, cloud, and many others.
Yes, yeah. So the mission that we've crafted within Aviatrix, the bold headline mission is to secure the world's digital fabric. Going back to, we really need this third leg of the stool around zero trust cloud workloads. But then the line, spring line right underneath that is by uniting dev, security, and network. That there's no way, like CEOs do and CIOs set up these groups on purpose so that you get a balanced delivery. Like, I want my developers to go as fast as they possibly can, but I don't want them to waste all the infrastructure and code insecure code and code poor quality code. So I'll have my QA department that tries to balance that out. I'll have my infra team that tries to balance that out, DevOps. I'll have my security team that tries to balance that out. And because of that, they've got competing metrics. They often have competing cultures, competing backgrounds. But when you go up 1,000 feet, they need to work together as a team. Right? All of them are trying to work together to get performant, not too wasteful, highly secure, highly featured elements out to their customers and to their employee base. And so one of the things I really like about how Aviatrix operates is it can serve all three teams very effectively and actually make them perform much more effectively together. That was one of the characteristics I loved about Splunk as well. It didn't have an opinion on data. It wasn't a structured data source. So you could have SecOps people, DevOps people, core IT ops people, all looking at the same data lake and getting benefit from it, which helped unite those teams. I think we've taken that to another level here with Aviatrix.
Can I add one point there? So we've been following this idea of convergence across networking and security for a few years now. And honestly, I think we were talking about it at an industry level pretty far ahead of where organizations were. And we're just getting to kind of a transition where we're seeing a lot of focus, from CIOs and CISOs and bringing these teams and technologies together. And you can argue kind of which comes first. But I think you mentioned SASE earlier, and I cover that space as well, and that's always held up as an example. But I think this is another great example of technology, networking and security coming better together to enable those teams to end up working together better. And there's a lot to overcome. You mentioned kind of KPIs, goals. They're just they're set up differently. Workflows, processes, there's a lot to get through, but that is a direction a lot of organizations are working. And so when you find tools that can kind of better support that, it's definitely worth prioritizing them.
Excellent. The author of our next question says, they have implemented MACsec network security religiously. Isn't that good enough?
That's a great one too. Salt Typhoon reared its head, 6-7 months ago, which was the acknowledgement and admittance that across major telecom and transport providers in the US and around the world, that there was some compromised equipment. So nation states and others could actually see into some of the packet data, which then raised the specter of, okay, you've got to have encryption, but encryption at a different layer if you want to make sure that you're safe. And MACsec is a reasonable alternative for encryption. It does have a number of limitations. So one, it's hardware driven, and in cloud, you don't control the hardware. That's the whole benefit of cloud, is it's virtualized infrastructure that you don't have access to. But MACsec decrypts the data between every hop. And to be pervasive and effective, there's gonna be multiple hops. There's my data center itself, there's my POP provider, there's the cloud I'm trying to get to. Typically the data will go from that cloud to another cloud. It might go out to a SaaS service, as John was talking about, and eventually make its way across that whole convoluted chain back to the data center or back to the user who might be sitting in a Starbucks somewhere. And if you want that pervasiveness, then it needs to be at the software layer, we believe. The challenge there is how do you do it at a reasonable speed? And again, going back to the Aviatrix point of view on this, I think encryption is an important component of a cloud-native security fabric. We have a very unique capability around high-performance encryption, where at a software layer, the way we've implemented it, you can actually get line rate encryption without putting in purpose-built software. purpose-built hardware. And then because of our footprint, that encryption actually can be pervasive inside the cloud, across clouds, edge to cloud, all the way back to the data center.
Excellent.
So the summary would be, I don't think maxed could be enough. And John, I'm sure you've got a point of view there as well. I've got my bias view, but
no. I mean, I think you covered it. I mean, it's certainly can be part of the solution. Encryption is certainly critical, but anyone who points at kind of one approach, one tool, and says that's the answer, it's typically not that easy. So, but you covered it off really well.
Excellent. I love that this next question starts to dig into what now. Given that securing workloads and networks clearly comes with growing costs, how can CISOs and CTOs justify their work in a boardroom short of experiencing an attack themselves?
Yeah, it is. You don't want to wait until after a cataclysmic attack. That's the wrong time. What is interesting about at least the Aviatrix approach, this cloud native security fabric, is on a cost basis. There is a cost, but there actually can be some savings as well, depending on how it's implemented. There is, I just argue, for a major attack surface that is exposed, cost justifying the spend is going to be important, but you need to drive the spend. It's that analogy I have in my mind is I've got an open house and I've got a ton of people coming in and out of the house that I don't always control. I kind of hang out the front door and try and make sure that people coming in and out look reputable. But if you don't have cameras across the house to have any visibility on where they're going and where they're touching, are they going into the safe in the closet? Are they going through your drawers in your master bedroom, one of the kids' rooms? You're just at a massive disadvantage. You can't be surprised when you walk back in and things are missing and taken. You've got bad consequences. So you have to find a way to justify core foundational elements of security in the first place. But with the right CNSF strategy, there's a lot of expense baked in these clouds, especially around data movement, egress. And the Aviatrix approach can actually help avoid a lot of those costs. And then there's additional costs in traffic flows as well. So there are ways that you can implement this. I mean, most people will have existing technologies as well that an effective CNSF strategy may be able to mitigate or even eradicate. So there are ways that you could justify investing in this critical third leg of the stool without a insanely large bill that you've got to pay. But I will assure you it's worth whatever the spend is, whether you choose Aviatrix or not, to make sure that you are able to close that attack surface. John, I'm sure you get this a lot.
Some of it comes down to, again, changing the way that those tech leaders are thinking more from a business perspective. So I think it starts with trying to quantify risk from a dollar perspective, and that takes time and effort, but there's a lot of information out there, whether it's breaches that have happened or reports like the IBM report, where you can start to look at your own infrastructure and assets and kind of understand what kind of what could be. And as you start thinking that way, I think you position yourself as, you have to put yourself out there a little bit. When you find a technology that you believe is going to help reduce that risk, having established yourself as kind of thinking in that way can kind of help you get those dollars. But as Doug said, I mean, it's not necessarily a given that it's going to cost more. So it's definitely work. You got to go through the whole exercise, but starting to speak their language and thinking about it from a dollars perspective can certainly help.
Excellent. I believe we are just about at time. For those that are interested in learning more, please check out our website, aviatrix.com, for more information on Aviatrix Cloud Network Security Fabric. We will also be hosting a webinar on August 5th, where we can dig more into the validation that both John and Doug have touched upon today as we dissect our recently conducted industry report. Thank you all so much for joining us today.